Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kat Bohannon. She is a researcher and author, and today we're going to talk about her book, Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. So, Dr. Bohannon, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us first, uh, why 200 million years? I mean, why do you go back to 200 million years ago? What happened back then exactly? And why do you start the story you present in the book 200 million years ago?
Oh, because I obviously lack ambition and like to tell small stories and like to make life simple for everyone in my life and for my readers. No, the reason 200 million is because this is a critical moment in the evolution of mammals. Because our bodies are, well, they're just not one thing. Any biologist will tell you, you contain many different moments in time. In many ways, the body itself is a unit of time. And so there are things in you that are fundamentally a part of your body plan and are very old. Yeah, your digestive system, there are features of it that are newer, our intestines are shorter than they used to be, blah, blah, blah. But what it's really doing, which is kind of squeezing stuff through and digesting it and eventually shitting, this is very old. This is a very old thing that your body is doing. Your brain is very recent. Now, parts of your brain are not so recent, but a lot of what we think of as characteristic of the human brain, the big frontal cortex, all that fancy stuff that it does, we give it a little too much credit. The human brain is too impressed with itself, I would say. But it is much newer, right? And so when you understand that the body is not arriving all at once into this moment we think of as a moment in history, this body we live in, that actually it's a continuation of processes that started a very long time ago, well, then it really is a matter of picking a moment, picking a point at which you say, the things I want to talk about kind of start here. Yeah. So what I wanted to do in looking at the new biology of sex differences in mammals and how they influence our lives as these very mammalian Homo sapiens we are today, was to go back to something around the dawn of mammals. Now that too was tricky around 200 million years ago because it's sort of like, well, there were theraspids before that. And so why mammalia forms? Why this moment, would say, a paleontologist might say. And I would say, well, the funny thing about sex differences is while they are not only tied to reproduction, they are often tied to reproduction. And in fact, a lot of the mammalian stories, what a mammal really is actually very much tied to how we make babies and how we keep them alive. And of those traits, then probably the first thing to look at is lactation, because that arrives when we're still laying eggs, which is a reasonable thing to do, but we start producing milk, and that becomes part of how we bring the second generation after us into the world and keep them alive.
So before we get into lactation and some of the other characteristically female traits that you explore in the book, do you distinguish here between sex and gender? Because since we're talking about females, I would imagine that by female, you're referring to sex exclusively, or not?
Yes, yes, and thank you for clarifying. It's good to do that right up front, as you know. I am very much of the camp that there's a strong difference between biological sex and human gender identity. That doesn't mean I don't think there are physical or mechanistic drivers for what would create a gender identity. I'm not saying it's all in your head, you know what I mean? I'm not saying that it's and it is by no means a mental illness unless identifying as a woman with this body is then also a mental illness. We don't entirely know what mechanisms in the brain and in feedback from the rest of the body create this messy, complicated thing we call gender identity. We don't actually know what drives it, but we don't know what drives it for anyone. so that it might be different in some populations, different than expected, I mean. Shouldn't be surprising. The brain does weird stuff all the time, right? And if I don't know what it is that makes me identify as a woman, with this very feminine body that I happen to have, these annoyingly large breasts and having given birth and all of these other things. No, it's true. I have to put them in this like industrial garment just to walk around. It's painful otherwise. That was true of my mother too. That's just the inheritance that I have. Thank you, biologist. This is just what I have to deal with. If I don't know what about that is making me identify as a woman, then it doesn't seem strange to me to say that, oh yes, we also don't know what a trans or a non-binary person is doing mechanistically in the brain to create this gender identity, but it certainly doesn't seem any less legitimate. But yes, the short answer is yes, big difference between biological sex and human gender.
And by the way, since you mentioned trans women briefly there, does what you explore in your book also apply to them or exclusively to cis women?
Depends what part of the body and experience we're talking about, right?
Okay.
And that's what's really interesting. So we're hypersocial primates, right? You and I and every other person we've ever met. That's just what we are, which means that we are always situated in this social milieu. We're always coming into being in our brains, modeling, because brains are so plastic, in our cultural environment, and then constantly negotiating between how we identify versus how others identify us and how that maps onto how we live our lives. We do this at every tier of our conscious experience all the time, even while the brain is busy doing complicated invisible body mapping things to remember, yes, I have that peripheral nervous signal and I do have a hand still. Good, just checking. We don't pay attention to that, us in the higher order conscious stuff, but it's going on as well. So this idea that we would be penetrated by constantly, well, maybe that's the wrong metaphor. It's a bit of a masculine metaphor. That we're always in the web of social influence is not surprising. And the reason I say all of that is that, well, trans women experience sexism too. Well, in fact, men experience sexism too, but what's interesting as a woman-identified person who's trans, right? Like as a trans woman, is that they have the experience of having this body that doesn't fit into how they understand themselves. And that understanding is perfectly legitimate. Your understanding of yourself is very individual, so is theirs, and yet they also then experience what it is to live in a world as a person who looks female. Because of how they look. And so they experience sexism as a female person, as a trans woman, so not a biologically female person, but they experience sexism in that way too. And that's this interesting and tricky thing, because of course they too experience the weird bullshit that every man has to deal with, which is whatever the hell manhood is supposed to be and whether or not one measures up, right? Almost every culture has some very complicated set of rules that men are supposed to follow that are very poorly defined and constantly in flux, which are likewise shaped by sexism. And that's built into the identity stuff too. So, right. So, which is to say, when I talk about sexism in the book, I think it very much applies to trans women. When I talk about what it is to give birth, well, that doesn't apply to people who don't have a uterus. But then again, there are biologically female people who are born without a uterus or have had to have it taken out, or who never give birth through one despite having one. And so it doesn't apply to them too, right?
Right. Right, I understand that. And I guess that will come back to the sexism bit toward the end of the interview, because that's also one of the, not a trait exactly, but a part of the experience that women usually go through right in their lives.
Yeah.
So we'll get back to that toward the end of our conversation. But
Okay.
one of the very interesting things that you mention in the book, and please, if I'm getting this wrong, correct me, is that one of the motivations for you to write this book was that you noticed, and other people noticed as well, that the study of the female body is lagging behind the study of the male body. And I guess that this applies not only to biology, but also to medicine. And in the specific case of medicine, that might have some very negative implications, right?
Radically negative, actually horrific implications. Yes, so I got the deal to start writing Eve back at the end of 2012. And at that point, literally no one had written for the public press anything about the male norm. And so I felt this incredible burden, you know, that I thought my book was somehow going to have to be this book and also a giant book about that because no one had ever heard of it. And no pressure because I was doing my PhD on an unrelated topic at the same time. So I was clearly not managing my life well, but I was so grateful when Carolyn Criado Perez's book came out that talked about invisible women, that talked about this gap in data, because it meant that I was able to mention it briefly in the intro to my book, not her book, but rather all of the work that I had done about it, and then not have to have the entire book be about it. It was a relief for me, and I'm so glad that more attention, in other words, has been paid to this simple fact. But for those of your listeners who have no idea what I'm talking about, we only study males. Oh, for God's sake, we're only studying male bodies in biology, and that has only recently started to change, right? Because there is this thing called the male norm. Sometimes it's called male bias in biology. And what it is that whether you're looking at rats or you're looking at mice or God up the chain, you know, to dogs and to pigs and to non-human primates and all the way up to clinical trials in biomedicine too, we're only studying males. And it's not, believe it or not, because of sexism. And as a woman, I can tell you, it's a relief to find something that isn't answered by, oh, well, that's just sexism again. Actually, in this case, it was good scientists being good scientists. Because in science, you want to control for your confounds. You want to make your experiment as clean as possible. You want to be able to interpret your data, to know what these numbers mean. And if you have too many confounding factors, it makes your data largely uninterpretable. You can't do a statistical analysis if you don't know what the fuck you're looking at, right? So that means if you have sexed mammals and you know one half of that group, you know, the females, has an estrous cycle. Human beings call this the menstrual cycle, yeah? That you have this cascade of hormones that's specific to each species in terms of the pattern, but you have this rise and fall of hormone changes that happens on a semi-regular basis, which influences, by the way, the entire body. We're not just talking about the ovaries and the uterus. Almost every tissue in a mammal's body, from bone and out, has sex hormone receptors and differing amounts and differing types. And what they do in any given body is variable, in fact. But they are influencing it. They are changing how those tissues respond. They're changing how these body systems behave. And because it does that, and because we don't have a good understanding of how it does it, or how it might be different in the male and the female, well, that's a hell of a confounding factor. So it's not like there was this sexist cabal or people rubbing their hands in a back room going, ha ha ha, we're not going to study females. It's more like, we're going to control for the confound of the feminine by just not studying females. We're going to study males, and we're going to assume that as long as we're not asking questions specifically about reproduction in the females, like if we're not trying to find things out about the damn uterus, we're just not going to have the uterus in the picture at all. That's how we're going to make it happen. Now, that seems all well and good if you are not aware, which in the very beginning many were not, that actually simply having this different distribution of sex hormone receptors across tissues, that simply living a female life, whether it's a mousy life or a dog life or a human life, is in fact very influenced by being sexed, you won't realize that you're missing a very important part of many different questions. So that's how it went for freaking decades. Unfortunately, basic science is precisely what leads to biomedical science. And so if you've never tested things on females and then you arrive at a clinical trial for, say, a pharmaceutical intervention or what have you, and then likewise in the biomedical spaces, you're not studying females for various reasons, well, then you might have medicines arrive on the market that had never been tested on females at all. And that has been, in a word, disastrous. Not every time, not every medication, but of the medications where it has mattered, which we're only finding out in retrospective data, it's effectively been a femicide. It's been horrible. It's been horrible, in a word. Sometimes it's been funny, and sometimes it's been a matter of actual excess death. And we're only just finally starting to catch up. But believe it or not, my book is optimistic, and I am in fact a friendly and optimistic person, even though I'm trying to rectify great wrongs. And so We started to change the rules in science in the 1990s for medical trials, but then realizing that, oh crap, that doesn't help us enough, even remotely, without having the basic science also fill in the gap. Then the NIH in the United States gave new rules and said, okay, instead of justifying why you have females, now you must justify why you do not. These are all good steps, and my book wouldn't exist without all the cool new science that has resulted, inevitably, in studying the biology of sex differences. But I will also say it is not enough, and there are enough loopholes to drive whole truckloads of, well, medications through. So there's still work to be done.
I bet this is just it's women's fault. It's their own fault because they're them hormonal fluctuations and all of that. Come on.
We are just so messy and complicated, aren't we? Well, male hormones fluctuate as well. It's just you're not quite so cyclical, and that's what's interesting about it. For example, we're more tied to the circadian rhythm, day and night, in our hormone fluctuations than you are. But you also do have an andropause. You do have a decline in a number of different androgen signals as you age. And that has been understudied too, frankly, which is part of why we don't have very good treatments for aging males. So we can fix this for everybody is the point.
Yeah, and just before we get into those pauses, the menopause, the andropause, and all of that, what about milk? I mean, how did it evolve, and what do we need milk for?
Milk, oh goodness. So like a lot of traits in our evolutionary path, it has a long on-ramp. There isn't a moment at which a boob arrives like a holy descent from the heavens and then there is nursing. No, in fact, milk starts 200 million years ago, probably a bit more actually, and it starts in this wonderfully gross and weird way. So milk is, okay, what is milk? Well, early milk is probably a lot like what you see in monotremes now. So those are the echidnas and the duck-billed platypus, the weirdos hanging out in Australia. Okay, so they still lay eggs, but they also lactate and have fur. They're actually little freak balls. We don't know how they haven't evolved away from this, but that's what they do. They are and are not like early mammals. So this is before we split into marsupials and placentals, okay? This is really, really dawn of mammals, and the ancestors of marsupials and the ancestors of placentals are just getting on board. And every kind of mammal is still laying eggs. And then, however, they sweat out this fluid from their skin that their pups lick from their bellies and abdominal wall. Now, they don't have nipples at this point either. They just have what are called mammary patches, which is true of the duck-billed platypus too. So between their adorable little bills, they lick and slurp milk from their mother's strange tummy after hatching from eggs that she's curled into her tail just before they give birth in this sort of damp burrow she's dug for herself, usually by the side of a stream. They're very strange animals, okay? But as monotremes, yes, they hatch and then they lick milk. So the Eve, which is the exemplar of the last common species that had the trait, the last common ancestor, that I pick for the milk chapter is Morganocodon. She's actually a whole genus, very, very common mammalia form. Presumably laid eggs, presumably lived in burrows, scuttling literally between the feet of dinosaurs. And she lactated. Her pups licked milk from her. But what's interesting and gross about where milk comes from, actually, is very similar, presumably, to sea turtles. Okay, so there are two different kinds of eggs, fundamentally, for us land animals, all right? There are leathery eggs, kind of soft, squishy, and there are calcified or hard-shelled eggs, which you would think when you crack an egg to make an omelet. You're in Portugal, you seem to put eggs on literally everything you eat, so you're very familiar with eggs, yes? You have a beautiful cuisine, and I'm well familiar with it. So when you crack an egg, you're cracking that calcified shell. That's what's happening when you put it into a dish, okay? And that calcified shell is something that has evolved in a few different lines in evolution. Mammals did not have that before they started. What we had were a bit like a number of species that lay leathery eggs. Now, when you lay a leathery egg on land, the immediate problem you have, besides that it's more fragile, right, is that it is more porous. You need to keep it damp. right? Because remember that all bodies evolved in shallow oceans and we never got over it. We are very water-based creatures, we earth animals, yeah? And so once we arrive on land, when we have these early moments when we're being laid in eggs and we're not amphibians anymore, okay? Well, you need to keep those damn things moist. Otherwise, the babies, before they're done, developing in the eggs, are going to desiccate. They're going to dry out and they're going to die. This is not a good idea. So all leathery egged creatures tend to secrete a kind of, well, it's a bit like snot. It's a bit goo, okay? It's like when you blow your nose. It's a mucus, yeah? From these specialized glands near where she lays her eggs, the mother, okay? So a sea turtle will do this too. And it really is an incredibly amount like blowing your nose. So there's this kind of mucusy thing that coats each of the eggs. And it primarily keeps the developing beings in those eggs moist, good. But it doesn't just do that because, if you've ever had anything rot in your fridge, you may have noticed that having things be moist and even remotely not frozen means having things which are prone to growth, prone to fungus and bacterial invasion. Yeah?
Yeah.
So if you want eggs to gestate for a certain amount of time and be moist, but not immediately be covered in fungus and be infected with every terrible bacteria you can imagine, well, this goo tends to have a lot of antifungal and antibacterial properties. And this actually is the theorized origin of milk. Yeah, because when these creatures, and they still do it today, hatch from their leathery eggs, they slurp up a little bit of this goo, which is still there. It's kind of their first meal. Now, if the mother is there nursing, kind of providing heat to the babies or in the den, as we assume Morgie was, they too would have slurped some of this stuff off of not only the eggs, but probably off of where it came off her butt, basically. So this actually is the dawn of the Madonna, people. This is where the holy lactation actually comes from. It's from licking goo off of the mama, and eventually in a long evolutionary chain, this goo turns into specialized stuff that glands evolve to produce, and eventually it takes on some of the watery properties too and becomes what we now call milk.
Well, I think it's just a beautiful story. So I don't see anything gross about it at all.
I love the idea. I love the idea that Eve in Bethlehem was sitting on a clutch of eggs. That would be wonderful and still a better situation than we have now.
Okay, so perhaps let's just...
Sorry, not that actually would be then, of course, Mary in Bethlehem. I take it back. Eve in the garden. Mary in Bethlehem with her holy clutch of eggs. Yes.
Okay, so let's trigger the conservatives a little bit more here.
Yes.
Can men and trans women produce milk?
Yes. Yes. Now, if you aren't trying to, if your nipple starts leaking milk and you weren't trying to have that happen, go immediately to a doctor. Because not only because of the obvious reasons that's not a normal thing to happen, but also because it probably means you have cancer. You very probably have cancer if you start lactating when you weren't actively trying to make that happen. You either have a tumor on your pituitary gland or you're developing breast cancer. Males can get breast cancer. You get it way less than females do, but you do. So, pay attention to that stuff. However, if you mean to try to, if this is a goal that you have as a person who has a Y chromosome but means to lactate, well, interestingly, I found out writing this book, trans women who want to nurse their babies that they have had born through surrogates or have adopted take the exact same sequence of hormones that a cis woman will do, a person with two X chromosomes and breasts that grew normally in puberty, who want to nurse adopted babies. Okay, so if you're a person who hasn't given birth for one reason or another, you don't have a uterus or your uterus didn't do the thing, okay? You're going to take a sequence of hormones. It's a medical treatment called the Newman-Goldfarb protocol, I believe, that effectively mimics the hormonal conditions of pregnancy and then birth. Yeah? And in any given body, whether you are biologically male or female, it is very likely to work. You will very likely begin lactating if you experience this sequence of hormones. And you will produce biologically identical milk, whether you have a Y chromosome or not. It's been tested. Now, you won't produce what's called early milk, which is colostrum, which is just that happens in the first few days after one gives birth. It's kind of yellowy, it's thick, and you don't make very much of it. All mammals do this in the first few days, and then you have what's called mature milk as your milk glands develop. You can't seem to do that with the protocol, and it might be tied to something the placenta does. No one really knows. However, again, you will produce milk. You may not produce as much of it as a person who has given birth themselves. However, there are a lot of people who give birth who have difficulty making milk. That's just a thing. It's wildly common. Never mind whether or not the baby's any good at getting it out of you. Mine were very much not and did horrific damage to my nipples. I can report. I won't show you, but I can report. It's healed. It's mostly healed. It was mostly bruising, but it was, it's like, dear Lord, why is that? They are so bad at that. But no, the milk that's made, I made plenty of it, but there are many cis women who do not. So it's not actually, in other words, that far out of the curve. If you think statistically, simply going through this protocol, no matter whether or not you are a trans person or non-binary person, you will probably produce milk. Now, why you would want to do such a thing is a totally separate question, okay? I would say the same to any cis women who want to nurse their adopted babies, having not given birth themselves. Wonderful that you want to. I don't judge you for your reasons. It is a difficult thing that you are doing, whether or not you have to do it through hormones or not. Lactation has a long evolved history, but it is not the point of your being as a parent. You don't have to do this, but you could.
So another thing that usually goes associated with, organs that are capable of producing milk is something that we, the guys, and also a few females tend to be quite fond of, that is breasts.
Yes, these big, like pendulous things full of fat that just hang off the front of my chest wall. Yeah. People are really into them.
But why are they there? I mean, is it really just to please the guys, or is there any other reason behind it?
I think I love this question, and it's true. I've been very curious. I would actually kind of love mine to be smaller. Frankly, they're annoying, but I just don't want to have elective surgery, and they haven't given me scoliosis. Some women have big enough breasts that it literally, provides a kind of horrible thing to their spine, and then surgically it's very useful to just make them smaller. Some people like to modify their bodies because of fashion, whatever. I've chosen not to, but it is true that people are fascinated by these damn things. So, is it for men or not? Are they full of fat and present in this very obvious physical way for men or not? I think a first principle that is always useful in the evolution of traits like these is to assume functionality before attractiveness. There are actually very few runaway traits that in sexual selection. So a runaway sexually selected trait is something like the male fiddler crab's giant claw. That one crab that has the one giant claw, and then the rest of his legs are just normal, and it really kind of sucks for him because he's like, what the hell with this claw? Yeah, but he's like, I got the claw though, and it's mostly because the females are attracted to the claw, and this is the assumption, right? And so that does seem to be a sexually selected runaway trait. But the thing is, in female traits, it's actually very unusual, especially in mammals, to have runaway sexually selected traits, precisely because our reproductive system is really costly. It's buggy. It's complicated. When things go wrong in the female mammal's body, in a mutation that, has a thing, the costs tend to be quite a lot higher for the entire population, precisely because we're the ones who make the next generation. So literally, if it makes us die or makes us worse at producing babies, then it's very likely that our species is not going to do well in terms of evolutionary fitness. Yeah. So, first of all, the idea that it would be a runaway trait is immediately suspicious, because it's like we have to lactate through these damn things, and we've already established in my conversation with you that it's not a perfect system. Actually, many, these days I wonderfully have the technological benefit of having had, a breast pump to, Hoover, Dyson, like suck industrial material out of me, to then nurse my child, which is something I chose to do. This is recently invented. This is not, so in other words, if it is so common, and it is, for children to have difficulty latching, or for newborns to have difficulty accessing milk because that breast isn't doing it as effectively as it might have, in, among others, well, that child is going to be compromised, right? That child is going to have problems. So if you think about messing with the boob just to make it look hot, well, it better not get in the way of the lactation, because guys, you're really going to screw up your whole species then. So that's a good first principle, functionality before attractiveness. The best theory I've seen, actually, for why we have the shape that we have, this breast shape, is that it's really nice to not suffocate. Here's what I mean by that. The human face has a plane from the side. If you look at a human face from the side, you'll see it's relatively flat, right? That the jaw lines up pretty well with the nose and the forehead, right? It's kind of like a semi-flat surface. And if you look at the profile of any given primate, including chimpanzees and bonobos, our local cousins, you have actually the position of the nose is there's more of a jutting jaw. It's not as flat a face, right? So when they suckle on this, mammary mound that is pretty close to the chest wall, their noses are not squashed against the chest wall when they try to nurse. They have no problem breathing and nursing at the same damn time. A human baby, if you were completely close to the chest wall, if you didn't have a slightly pendulous, slightly manipulable, upturned nipple and a kind of swinging structure that can kind of move around, would probably have to hold their breath while they nursed, which seems like a bad idea, just as a design option. That just doesn't seem like a good idea. So the best theory I've seen for why we have the shape we have is that it was easier for babies to nurse.
And so when does the placenta come into the picture, and why did females at a certain point just decide to abandon the egg? Because it seemed a little bit easier to just lay eggs, right? So.
Oh my God, it's so much better to just lay eggs. Are you kidding? This is obviously a better way of going about having babies. It's actually kind of batshit crazy that placentals produce babies the way that we do. Because remember, you're not simply like, it's not, so what is it to have a placenta? What is it to have live birth the way we do and marsupials do? It means that you're not simply holding your clutch of eggs inside your body to keep it warm. You actually have the damn thing docking onto you with a direct tissue contact, which we call the placenta. So you've probably heard of the umbilical cord. That's that tube that runs from the baby to the mother's body. But it docks then. There's a place where it kind of, and it's very Guillermo del Toro. It's very sort of horror movie. If you've ever seen a picture of a placenta, it is gnarly to look at. So I'll leave you to the internet to go look. But it's this fleshy thing that invades the wall of the uterus, and to varying degrees then interacts with the mother's bloodstream to draw material out, blood and nutrients and building blocks. It's hard to build a body, right? Right. So that is crazy for a number of reasons. It's incredibly dangerous for the maternal body, because now you're interacting with the maternal immune system. So you can get runaway inflammation. Remember, this is an invader. It's half of you. It's not all of you. It's what's called a partial allograft, okay? So you're somewhere between a baby and a tumor when you're doing it this way. It's an invasive process. And of course, the embryo...
actually, Dr. House called it a parasite. So
it's not... it's tricky. It's not only a parasite. It's fun to think of it as a parasite. Fun because it's taboo and we can make fun of how babies are, I think I call them blood-sucking demon fetuses, in the human body. And it's true. Our embryos are very greedy, and our placentas are incredibly invasive. They penetrate the mother's bloodstream in ways that is only true for a handful of body types, which is why we menstruate the way we do. So no, the thing is, it's because it's a partial allograft, there is some, immunological recognition, if you like. It's made of half of our genetic material, but it is different enough that it is also more like a parasite. Anyway, the point is that to do that in deep evolutionary time, and now we're moving more towards the moment. So the placenta evolves before the asteroid comes down, knocks out all the dinosaurs except for a bunch of still unhappy birds, right? Like before, in that moment when the dinosaurs go and the mammals fill their niches, the placenta had already evolved, but then it becomes more of a dominant thing. It becomes more of a dominant thing after, in the conditions of the post-asteroid apocalypse, right? Where this, for some reason, was either advantageous or just not deleterious enough. Right. And for some reason, more of the marsupials' ancestors died out because of that asteroid than the placental mammalian ancestors died out. We don't know exactly why. Now, kangaroos and all of those sorts of little creatures are mostly isolated to Australia, except for some South American places where they originally evolved. And the rest of us mammals are doing live birth. Okay. The reason it's crazy, the reason it's a terrible idea is that you have direct conflict. You have maternal fetal conflict because you have one pool of resources. And if you imagine that the uterus is an environment, well, you have two beings effectively, although it's a proto-being when it's an embryo, long evolved to both stay alive and compete for resources in that local environment. So the embryo, because that's what the placenta does, has to somehow down-regulate the maternal immune system to allow it to not be treated like an invader. But the maternal body also somehow has to endure an incredible amount of resources being sucked out of it on the regular by a creature that's down-regulating its immune system, which of course makes it more vulnerable to infection, which drives up its blood pressure, right. So it's a problem. It is a problem to have live birth. It's not a great situation for us.
So, of course, we don't have time here, unfortunately, to a certain extent, to get into all of the different steps of the evolution of the reproductive organs of the human female. But, I mean, something that the other day dawned on me, this thought never crossed my mind before, was that I was talking with a friend of mine about embryo development, about prenatal development, and suddenly it dawned on me, oh my God, we, the guys, are all trans people because we all started off as female.
Inside a female body? Oh, that's an interesting metaphor. That's an interesting metaphor. I can't speak to what it is to be a trans person and whether or not that would resonate with such a person. It is true, however, that there is in many ways a mosaicism in many parts of the body where a thing you would expect to be, statistically sex typical, one tissue to another, doesn't always follow the rules. This is most obviously true in the brain, but it seems to be true in some other tissues as well. But we're only finally starting to get that picture because we're finally studying the biology of sex differences. We didn't know before. We're only finding that out now.
So another interesting thing here that you talk about in the book is the female orgasm. So, I guess that some people would be wondering, why do you need these orgasms for exactly? And how do you orgasm?
The female or the male?
The female.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, on first principle, the reason for the female orgasm is that females have pleasure and that pleasure should be valued. Thank you very much.
Really?
I've heard of that, but it's worth saying. I feel like it's worth saying anywhere because at some point maybe we'll all finally believe it. Okay, so there's that. But I think you were probably trying to ask me as someone representing the science behind it. Right.
Sure.
Yeah, so unfortunately, female typical orgasms, this was a beautiful little paper that came out some years ago, seem to be tied to ovulation. Once upon a time, the female orgasm may well have triggered the egg follicle, the developed egg hatching, as it were, out of the ovary and making its way into the fallopian tube. You can still see a little bit of this in the rabbit, actually. So one of the reasons that rabbits have so many babies, that's the stereotype, why we love to say the Easter Bunny is a rabbit because of ancient Roman fertility rites, and why we associate them with just, sex and babies in general, is because they ovulate in response to coitus. They get laid and they immediately ovulate. That's how it works in them. They don't have the estrous cycle the way we do, in that they, are only fertile for a little bit. They could potentially be fertile whenever they have sex. Okay, and so the female orgasm seems in deep, deep time, not just because of rabbits. This is also true, I think, in a few other body plans, to release an egg. Now, thankfully, just birth control alone, that is no longer the case. These things have been decoupled, okay? And in the human body, the female orgasm is not at all tied to ovulation. It is tied to our sense of satisfaction. It is tied to potentially bonding with our mates, maybe sometimes. It's tied to enjoying the very messy and often unpleasant process of living in a body and being mortal. It's tied to all those things, but it's not tied to ovulation anymore.
So it's just for pleasure then?
Yes.
Oh my God. That's really...
Now that said, we often confusingly tie what we call the neurological condition of having an orgasm, getting past the breakers, the wave, the arriving at the moment and the trumpet sound, whatever your metaphor is, fine. We confuse sexual arousal and orgasm, in that it is not the case that a woman cannot enjoy sex without having had an orgasm in that classic sense. Lots of us do, and unfortunately, many of us won't even experience our first orgasm until later in life, in part because we've had many lousy lovers who have no idea what a clitoris is. Fine. But also, there's like sexism, and there's just gender mess, and there's also the simple fact, from what studies have been done on it, that the vast majority of women do not have orgasms without clitoral stimulation. Simply penetration tends not to, in part because the vagina itself doesn't have as many nerves in it. So it's not as dense a signal as you like as the clitoris and its extended structure. Some women do have, some people with vaginas do have orgasms from penetration, but usually that's not sufficient. So anyway, now you've had that little bit of public service announcement for what female orgasms are for and how they work.
But this is highly controversial, because I've heard that there's a book or several books out there where people claim that non-reproductive sex is a sin. So that should be a problem, no?
Oh, well, you see, I thought it was a sin to make people suffer unnecessarily. I thought the greatest sin actually was to make other people's lives worse in obvious and measurable ways, which is to say, I thought devaluing the pleasure of others' lives and devaluing the existence of people who are not like yourself was the greatest sin, but perhaps I'm confused.
Yeah, perhaps you are. And something that I would imagine is not exactly for the sake of your pleasure is menstruation. So why do you?
Some people are into that, me not particularly. There is a whole subset of people who are really, really into it, and not simply in kink space, but just in the experience of having a body, and I respect them. Personally, I'm happy to not have a whole lot of it. I have an IUD, and so that thins the lining of my uterus, and that means that at this point I experience very little externally obvious menstruation. That is different for every patient, of course. But no, the point of menstruation actually is to build a barrier between the maternal body and the incoming growing fetus. The reason we build up the lining of the uterus is precisely because we have a very, very invasive placenta in our species. And so if we didn't do that, we might well die, trying to become pregnant, if we do, hopefully choose, hopefully it is a choice, become pregnant without having built up that lining. And why we shed it externally, as opposed to reabsorb it, most species that do this reabsorb it, just so you know. It just is probably more, it's a cost analysis. For whatever reason, our bodies evolved in a way that it was less costly to just shed the stuff than to just resorb it when we're done using it. Who knows why? We're stuck with it.
So one of the things that really, I wasn't expecting for you to cover in the book, it surprised me, was primate perception and female perception. So why is it that you also talk about that specifically? Are there some important ways by which female perception differs from male perception?
Well, there were two reasons why. The first and obvious reason is that I was interested in whether or not there was anything important in sex differences. At that moment, we become primates, when our ancestral line evolves out of merely mammals and early primates arrive, and what about the story of their evolution may or may not apply to sex differences. Because you and I are equally primate, but we are also sexed, so okay. So what was interesting about that moment to me, the arrival of primates, is that it's very much a perception story. Now, by perception, I mean our sensory array. Okay, I don't just mean our cultural perception, just to clarify. I mean, this thing we call a sensory array, which is effectively your head, your face. You hang your sensors, your primary sensors, on this very usefully swivelable, part of your body that you can turn in one direction or another, and has ears on either side of it and eyes towards the front, and the nose and the mouth right centrally, and there you are. That's your sensory array, perceiving the world around you in varying degrees specific to your species. What's interesting about primates is this is a moment where we really are evolving in the trees, specifically in angiosperm forests. So this is something that's a bit new after the apocalypse that killed off the dinosaurs. In the smoking holes that were left, a bunch of fruiting trees took hold and created these incredible canopies full of delicious hanging fruit that, of course, many different species then evolve to eat. And then, of course, beneficial to the trees, poop out their seeds in various spots, making hence new trees. Right, so there's this long, messy process of creatures taking advantage of this new environmental condition, this new ecosystem is growing. And primates are very, very much a part of it. So one of the best theory goings, I think, for why primates are the way they are, many features of our bodies, is that we evolved to eat fruit in angiosperms, hanging on what's called the distal branches, the thinner branches where the fruit is, out towards there. So our proprioception, our ability to move, that so many of us have these grasping hands, of course. Most primates are still in the trees, not all, but many. We still have that opposable thumb, that grasping thing that grabs on to a branch. And also our perception, however, because optimizing to eat not just bugs anymore, which a lot of early mammals did, we were insectivores, but also fruit now, means being able to tell when tender leaves and ripe fruit are ripe, which means you have to see color in a certain way. It means having to hear and see things in this complicated environment that isn't just back and forth, but up and down. Very 3D once you live in the trees. That's a very different sensory environment than when you're scuttling along the ground and living in burrows, right? So it seemed to me that the moment we become primates is really deeply about trees. It's really about our sensory array. And because there are known sex differences in primates, for our sensory array, slight differences in our visual perception, slight differences in our hearing, and a little bit in our noses, olfaction too. That seemed like an important story to tell.
Those stories that sometimes we hear about women when it comes to color vision, being able to distinguish between more colors than men and seeing more colors, and when it comes to smell, being more sensitive to smell and being able to identify different, more smells than, more odors than men. Is that true?
Yes, actually, but not always in
Mm,
the ways you might think, and not always for the reasons you might think. Now,
okay.
when it comes to vision, when it comes to our eyeballs, there are certain kinds of color blindness that are X-linked traits, which means that if you only have one X chromosome, you're more likely. So there is a male typical color blindness. Not all males have it, but males do have it for the lack of the X chromosome. There are other kinds of color blindness, but men are more likely to have this kind. So there's the
Okay.
most simple and obvious way that many men are less good at color because you have a hard time, if you have this, distinguishing, as my husband does, between red and green. You know, he'll ask me to bring over the red blanket, which is very brown. It is a very actually brown blanket. There is no mistaking it. And I often have to be like, you mean the brown blanket? He's like, yeah, that one, you know, because I'm cold. Bring me the thing that we both
Yeah.
understand. Why'd you have to correct me? And likewise for green things versus red things. So in the ancestral condition, this may or may not have been a big problem. It's still so common that it clearly wasn't so costly that anyone who had it would die. Let's put it that way. But when you eat certain kinds of fruit, when you are creatures that optimize for eating a tender green, you know, reddish green sort of bud versus a more mature leaf, which might be less nutritious for you or harder to digest, it can really be advantageous to have something like color vision, if you are, of course, creatures that are living in the daytime and not the nighttime, which was a big shift for a lot of primates. We began as nocturnal creatures and then we shifted to day eaters. And that, of course, totally changed our color vision. Yeah. So that's the thing. Now, whether or not it's true that a typical cis woman can look out and understand fine differences between the colors of a freaking shirt, this feels cultural. This feels maybe, if you're not literally colorblind, I think that's just how that brain evolved to pay attention to certain things, which is probably like a culturally situated whatever, right? I don't know that it's actually true that we are more aesthetically responsive as females. That seems like a weird, like, gender story or something. I think there are many male people who are perfectly excellent at being, for example, fashion designers. Thank you very much. However, it is true that there are a number of women who are tetrachromats. There is this extra gene that can produce extra, the ability to do, let me say that again. There are people who, because of having two X chromosomes, may have extra copies of things in their retinas that let them see a more diverse array of color. Something more akin, in fact, to what birds do. They have eyes, or at least they have retinas, like birds, but they don't know that they do. You have to do a genetic test for the damn thing, and then you have to see if they even experience it. Because, of course, when we grow up, we live in a sensory world in which we live, which is optimized for trichromatism, which is what you and I probably have. You know, picture a stoplight. You can see certain colors, and we live in a social environment in which that sensory ability is rewarded. Right? We don't need to see things like birds. It's not useful to see a weird shimmering rainbow coming off of every single time you see a wave on the ocean. You know, it's not rewarded. So in many cases, most of the genetically tetrachromat folk can't really say what they are seeing, or may not even consciously register that they're in fact seeing millions more colors, distinguishable colors, than we are. There's been, I think, only a handful of people, maybe one or two, who are, yes, women, who are tetrachromats, who know that they are seeing this incredible array of colors and can report it. So really, this weird number, up to maybe a quarter of all women, are like secret superheroes that just haven't trained their powers.
But about the smell bit, I mean,
Yes.
we're being very feminist here, but let's try to be a little bit more gender equal, because what I'm about to ask you is something that many times when women, for example, are pregnant, makes men who wake up at 4 a.m. and go out to buy chocolate or whatever. So are
Oh, that's
women?
just a partner being very nice. Okay. It's not that we have to have a 4 a.m. chocolate. It's just that, well, there's two levels there. Now, that isn't, well, that's part of olfaction because to have a craving for a food is partially to desire the taste, and taste is greatly a part of smell. But it's also very much a brain-based thing that's somehow interacting with your enteric nervous system, your guts, that also desire a food. So wanting a food is actually kind of a whole body thing, which indeed does go a little haywire when you're pregnant, famously so. You also will experience more revulsion towards certain tastes and smells that you didn't feel repulsed by before at all. And that's what's interesting. So two things are going on there, or at least that's the theory. There may be shifts in raw olfaction, your ability to smell and taste, which may be heightened, in other words, or changed in some deep way. You become better at smelling faint things, maybe, when you're pregnant. So that's like a nose-based kind of thing. And then there's just brain-based stuff, which is your emotional response to this stuff, right? Because it's not simply when you smell a thing, then you have an emotional response to what you smell. Not simply like in a Proust Madeleine, like, oh, I have memories of my childhood and I like eating chocolate, you know, whatever, right? It's more like we are always, our brains are always already emotional. That's how we are as these social primates, right? So there's literally never a moment you're not having some emotional response.
Wait a minute, are men also emotional? That's another controversial.
Very much so. You cannot have a brain and not be emotional. Okay? It's just Lisa Feldman Barrett has talked a lot about this. You know, there are many very excellent scientists who have been trying to convince people that this thing we call emotion is not so segregated. You know, this is not. Antonio Damasio also talks about this. You know, all of these categories of emotional response are very much embedded in literally every thought that we have. We just only register those very emotional things. It's like, oh, well, that's emotion. It's like, no, literally everything you're doing with your brain involves emotion. Anyway, moving on. So emotional response then when you're pregnant may well be heightened to not only olfactory signal, but to many things. And that is absolutely a response to the hormonal craziness that pregnancy involves. And so that's why disgusting things smell very disgusting, and things that normally don't smell disgusting may well for that person suddenly be disgusting. And that other thing that they're normally not that into suddenly becomes the thing that you require at 4 a.m. Some of that is your nose. Some of that is your nose, but not all of it.
And is that in any way also a mechanism to protect the fetus from potential bad foods? I mean, infections or something like that?
Maybe. That's one of the good theories going for it. And there are ways of testing it and ways not of testing it. And of course, we don't test it in pregnant human beings. We do this more to pregnant rats and see, do they avoid the poison or not? But when pregnant. The idea is that there are some tastes that, like bitter tastes, are very commonly associated with many kinds of toxic things in the world. So we tend to have a very negative response to things that taste bitter. We tend to have more of a negative response when we're pregnant. And one assumes that that could have an evolved feature, that this would be beneficial to avoid poisons, because the plant world turns out it's full of poison, when you are a pregnant body. So yes, so it may well be that there is some avoidance that gets heightened when you're pregnant, and that your changes in your taste and your emotional response to taste and scent are sort of a built-in, evolved, advantageous feature. There may also be a nutrition seeking that happens because, again, we've established that it's crazy not to lay eggs. So, you may well seek certain kinds of nutritive sources when you are pregnant that you wouldn't normally be so desirous of. But let's not always assume one-to-one. Not everything that happens in pregnancy is an evolved thing that's advantageous. Some of it is very much accident. Some of it just sucks.
But then you arrive at a point in our evolutionary history where you have this new reproductive system, you have pregnancy, you have birth, but then we become bipedal. And I guess that to a certain extent was not very pleasant, right?
Some of it was great. Okay, some of bipedalism which is walking on two legs, because the assumption is before we were based largely in the trees, and we did a little bit of walking around on two legs, like tree-based primates sometimes do, but it wasn't our primary mode of locomotion. Yeah. We were never knuckle walkers. That's a thing that we've been correcting in the paleo record. And, you know, those little diagrams where you see the knuckle walker on the left and evolves up to a guy walking, and then you see him usually for a joke at the end sitting at a computer typing. And this is the evolution of man. Yeah. Well, so it's actually the case that no, we were more like these things with our arms up in the trees, and then skip the knuckle walking altogether because that's a separate evolutionary path. Okay. So anyway, walking upright means shifting the pelvis a bit in order to have a better structure to anchor the buttocks. Actually, one of the big ways we walk actually is our butts. It is in fact the biggest single muscle, the gluteus maximus, in the human body, and it is incredibly important, and it is anchored in all kinds of ways. You actually have a number of butt muscles: gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, exactly as it sounds. Anyway, so you have a number of butt muscles holding you up there, and then your spine forms a curved shape to absorb, you know, impact, because there's a lot of force now and what have you, and suddenly you're an upright being. But of course, because we have long evolved to give birth through a birth canal, which is situated down going between the hip bones, well, bringing the hip bones upright, unfortunately, also means closing the pelvic opening to make it a little bit smaller than it used to be. Yeah, so that has been ever since not great. Not great, I would say. Not wonderful at all. Because you see, we now have the condition of very large babies and very small pelvic openings through which our birth canal passes. Okay? We have what's called an obstetric dilemma. Now, it's been used to explain lots and lots of things. I think the most compelling thing about the obstetric dilemma is simply that it's dangerous, not that it shaped everything in our path. The most dangerous feature of our reproduction is our placenta, actually. But still, getting them out of the body, not great, because you're trying to take a watermelon-sized thing and squeeze it through a lemon-sized hole. And if you've met fruit, you can understand that mechanistically, this is a problem. And we, from pelvic analyses and comparative morphologies and what have you, we now have a general sense that starting at least by Lucy, the Australopithecine, 3.2 million years ago, we had this problem. We had a too narrow opening in these bipedal hominins and relatively large babies. And the assumption then is that Lucy, like us, probably had a midwife.
Yeah, I mean, it would be very interesting to get into the midwife a bit, but unfortunately, taking into account our time limit, and because I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to ask you about this, let's move on to another topic. Okay. What about menopause? I mean, why is it that at a certain point in the life of females, they reach a point where they are no longer able to reproduce, but they still live past that?
It is one of the great biological mysteries, actually. Now, it is not a mystery why a person who no longer gives birth is valuable to society, and we often confuse those questions, okay? The entire point of a woman's life is not simply to make babies, thank you very much. But this is also true in the evolutionary sense, believe it or not. This is also true in the deep evolution of our body plans, because what we fundamentally are, of course, is not simply baby makers. What we fundamentally are, again, is social primates. And each member of our communities contributes equally to the success of our communities because we are so interdependent, so communally bound. Yeah? So that means, of course, that our elderly, should they survive to become elderly, are valuable to the community for many reasons. But let me first say, getting back into the mechanisms of it, the reason it's a mystery that menopause exists, in part, is because we are one of the only species that has it. Okay? The only confirmed, for sure confirmed, everyone in the scientific community 100% agrees, creatures that have menopause, which is to say we live a full third of our lives after having stopped ovulating, after having stopped having had the ability to make babies, are human beings and a handful of toothed whales. Pretty much that. Yep, the ones we know most about among the toothed whale are orca, killer whales. So basically we have humans and we have killer whales, and that's what we're working with in terms of understanding menopause, which is not a great scientific situation to be in part because, of course, killer whales live in the damn ocean, and it is hard to study killer whales because boats and ocean. Anyway, so we finally did, however, figure it out. And we were able, we, the scientific community, not me, I didn't do this research, but the people who did are brilliant. So one of the big theories for what, the evolutionary conditions in which menopause was favored, in the rare cases it is that maybe menopausal females who no longer have their own babies can then help with the child care for the third generation. They don't have a competition for resources with their daughters to provide for their offspring. Yeah. And they can then, and they're free. They have more free time, as it were. It's kind of like the kindly grandmother's going to help out with childcare while the daughter, the mother of that grandchild, can go do other things, right? So this was the idea for how menopause may be evolved. It's called the grandmother hypothesis. Okay. Cool. I loved my grandmother too. She died before she was able to help with childcare, but she was a lovely woman. I remember her cookie jar. And I would like that to be the story. However, it does not seem to be the case that at least among the only other known type of creatures that have menopause, that they help out with the third generation more. Actually, in killer whales, they don't help protect the grandbabies more. They don't help get more food and do more food sharing with that generation because they have so much free time. No, actually, the only thing they're known for among these menopausal orcas, who are matriarchal, by the way, the menopausal grandmothers are very much the grand dams in charge of the whole business for the whole pod. In times of stress, they are good at leading the pod to good sources of food. Okay, so the local easy food has run out. These menopausal grandmothers are good at knowing where the hell the rarer sources that are reliable of food are located, and they literally lead the damn pod there. They're also more involved in teaching younger generations specialized hunting techniques. Like, that thing where you may have seen a video online where you see orca, killer whales lining up in a row, and then they bum rush an ice floe where a seal is sitting on top of the ice, and the bow wave of their movement knocks the seal off the ice, which is a very good day for the killer whales and a very bad day for the seal, right? Yeah. Yes. So that's a specialized hunting technique that has to be taught. And the matriarchs are very much involved in the teaching of the young, which is to say, in that situation, what the menopausal grandmothers are good for is simply still being alive and knowing stuff. Okay? So let's think back to the human beings. What if all of humanity selected for traits that extended our lifespan? We know it did. We know for a very long time. We died around 35, okay? But at some point, and the assumption is it's many different traits in the body, we evolved the ability to live longer. We evolved the ability to live into our freaking 60s, 70s, God, 80s, now even hundreds. That's a runaway train. But we have evolved longevity, human-type longevity, okay? Which would be beneficial to everyone should you manage to make it, precisely because then you have generations that remember how to survive difficult conditions that are rare, right? So both grandmothers and grandfathers then would be good at remembering how to survive the flood that had happened 30 years ago, because they were alive at the moment that a lot of other people were literally not yet born. Okay? In a social environment, before you have anything like, God, the written word, are you kidding? No, when all you have is the ability to talk to one another, when all you have is the ability to, maybe a little bit better than monkey see, monkey do, the elderly members of the group are very good at helping an interdependent group survive a dangerous world. And so the reason we have menopause in that case is more that the ovaries never got the message. They're still running the old monkey plan. And it turns out this is true. Our ovaries are senescing at a very typical rate for a primate. There have been studies now that look across species that indeed our ovaries are aging at a sort of normal primate rate given an expected lifespan. And it's just that they never got the message that they were supposed to live longer. Personally, I'm very glad for this because I don't want to give birth in my 70s. I'm good. I'm good. I'm happy, in fact, to be done with the 2 times I have given birth, and to literally never do that again would be ideal. Because the way we do it is, again, terrible. But it does mean that we have a lot of knock-on effects, unfortunately, a lot of postmenopausal conditions like osteoporosis and other things in which there is a kind of mismatch between the older body and the rest of our body systems and the ovary, which had long been evolved in this complex hormonal signaling system that, you know, keeps everything in check, right? The endocrine system, in other words, that then changes and starts to screw things up a bit.
So, I mean, this might be a sort of very short psychoanalytic session, but I mean, since we're talking about older women, I'm very worried about this bit here. So, because there are some older women that I find very attractive, but then I tune into manosphere podcasts and I don't know, red pill community forums, and they basically say that women have an expiration date. So am I a freak or what?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes and no.
Oh my
You
God.
may be a freak in that you give a damn about women's suffering. That, unfortunately, may be more of the signal, given how much of the world seems to not. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing. In terms of whether you're a freak in kink space, no, actually, attraction to older bodies seems very common. You need only look at the internet and porn for granny porn. My God, it's everywhere. So no, that seems a very common thing that many people are into, and you need not get into the details about how into it you are. Okay? Now, as far as...
I wouldn't do it.
I wouldn't dream of asking. No, so I would say, at least in the manosphere, and the idea of women having an expiration date, well, you know, I'll even have a little bit of sympathy here. Whenever somebody needs to make the claim that somebody else has an expiration date, it's usually because they have anxiety about their own. Okay, so usually a lot of this bigotry, a lot of this misogyny, a lot of this crap is inevitably coming from somebody who doesn't know what to do with their own vulnerability, you know, that something about their lives really sucks and they don't know how to feel about it. And they live, indeed, in this case, in a sexist world that is also hard on men in different ways. And the way that they are coping is by being assholes. So, you know, we're not perfect beings, okay? Many of us cope by turning into assholes. It's just some are worse than others about it. Scientifically, though, I think you also mean to ask me, however, you may not know, although having read my book, maybe you do, that among other primates, actually aged females are often the most attractive members of a group. So chimpanzees, at the very least famously so, are extremely attracted to the eldest females in their group. That chick is the sexiest thing to a chimp male, and she will have her teeth falling out. She will have patches falling out of her hair. I mean, you know, there's granny porn, and then there's what chimps are into. My God, they are into very elderly females. Now, in part, it may be because many chimpanzees indeed do give birth when they're elderly, and so simply having signals that you have survived that long and having well-established social hierarchies in this group where you may be an alpha female at this point is a very sexy thing to a chimp male, you know. So, you know, maybe your desires are a continuation of older patterns. I couldn't say, but I think actually when it comes to human sexuality, though, assume diversity is the norm. We're just really horny. We are horny creatures, and we are often promiscuous creatures. And so that anyone would have something they're into isn't surprising. It just shouldn't be surprising. That's just how we are with sort of everything.
But I guess that makes a very good segue into my last question, and I hope this is a quick one because I'm really getting mindful of your time here.
No worries.
But do we have any idea where sexism comes from? I mean, because it's one thing for it to exist, but where does it stem from exactly?
Let me make sure I know what you most want out of this question. Do you mean when did sex evolve, males and females, like way the hell back, like
I mean, perhaps
before fish? Or do you mean Sex in the human body, or what do you mean?
I mean, perhaps two different aspects to the question.
Okay.
First of all, since we're talking here about evolutionary biology, if you think there are any evolutionary bases for sexism, that's the first one, and the second
Sexism.
one,
Oh, sexism. Okay.
sexism,
Oh.
and the second one, I mean, culturally speaking, when did things like the patriarchy started and all of that?
You mean the final chapter of my book? Yes. Let's see
Yeah.
if I can do that chapter quickly. Let's see. Well, I can tell you a few important features of that chapter. The first
Yeah.
is that I have always found it very suspicious when we see women reinforcing sexist rules, which is very, very common. Very, very common. It's not rare, even remotely. It is extremely common that in sometimes the most vocal, advocates of gender norms and sexism in general, things that would seem to not benefit them or any other female that they're advocating for, is somehow what's called internalized sexism, which somehow, in other words, that they have taken sexist ideals which must evolve from the patriarchy and from men, that men would be the origins of sexism, and then they've taken it into themselves, and they're just poor, pathetic little puppets, mouthing the ideas of others. And you see similar ideas that are equally patronizing about poor people advocating for conservatism when it doesn't benefit them, economically in various countries. In other words, we like to denigrate people who seem to me making political and social choices that don't obviously benefit themselves. So it's useful to not be so patronizing. There's always that as a first principle. But in biology, it's also useful, and this is something I do in the book, to say, well, no, we actually know that huge numbers of women are advocates for very restrictive sex rules. And what I mean in here, it's like a subset of sexism, which is what females can wear, where they can go in a day, what sort of jobs they can have, who they can interact with, and definitely anything around anyone they might have sex with, and then on into the baby making and the norms for all of that, right? That they're very vocal advocates for this kind of stuff. It seems to me a bit foolish to think that this is simply internalized sexism, that no, there must be something driving this, because we are, of course, any good behaviorist will tell you in biology that we are social beings. We are all equal participants in our social rules. We generate them, we reinforce them, we push against them. We're all doing this together. None of us is in control of the rules, right? We're all building them and making them and reinforcing them all the time throughout our lives. Women too. And so I thought, well, okay, I've just spent a decade of my life thinking about deep time and body plans and evolution, and what would an evolutionary biologist say about all of this? Well, a lot of these sex rules are directly tied to the levers of reproduction, okay? So they have to do with access to female bodies. How much of that body can be seen? In what context and by whom? How much of that body can be approached in what context and by whom? And God, by the time you get to anything directly involving sex, there are many, many, many rules, right? And of course around baby making too, which is to say, all of this constellation of sex rules together are manipulating culture by culture the fertility of the females in that culture. When she has babies and under what conditions and with whom, right? Now, if you think back to an ancestral state where, again, female birth is incredibly dangerous, female, right? Sorry, by female birth, I simply mean giving birth is dangerous. Being pregnant, giving birth, and the postpartum recovery period, and then lactation and everything else, this is a vulnerable, dangerous period that is hard to do. Okay, so controlling when and how you get pregnant, culture by culture, the rules are different, but every single one has rules. Access to female bodies, every culture is different, but we all have strong rules and we feel strongly about them. This is manipulating fertility patterns. That's the biological perspective. And in deep time, culture by culture in various environments, that way may well have been biologically beneficial. It may have helped more females survive and thrive in their babies too, right? Because in some environments, it might be good to have cultural rules that effectively cluster your births. That at the start of your reproductive life, you have a bunch of babies, and then you just raise those babies, and that's how you do it. Now, that's going to be differently rewarding depending how much food is available, if it's seasonal, et cetera, right? In other environments, it might be better to space out your births. Might be better to start later and have a later cluster, right? After you have arrived at a certain point in a social milieu, arrived at a certain point with a certain social status, right? That the births come later after you've achieved it. Anyway, the point is that every human culture seems to have something like a drive. I know scientifically the word drive is complicated, but we seem driven nonetheless, not only to create culture, but to create sex rules within our many cultures and then strongly reinforce them. And when we change them, then strongly reinforce the change. And we always feel very passionately about it. And it seemed to me that that's simply something that human beings may well do precisely because we're so bad at giving birth. But the thing is that we also evolved this beautiful thing called human-type gynecology. We have an incredible tool set that comes from the dawn of midwifery back in the Australopithecines and all the way forward. We're much better at it now. That also intervenes on human fertility and is actually a hell of a lot better at keeping women and girls alive and thriving and surviving through the messy process of having a female body. So maybe just now we arrive at a moment in human evolution where we can get our heads above water and choose.
And I mean, if people want to learn more about that and other aspects of our sociality, they can, of course, read your book, Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Bohannon, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk with you.
It's been fun to talk with you too, and I hope you all enjoy the book.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles de Moray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Unic, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.